Good afternoon, and welcome to today's discussion focused on strengthening school emergency operations plans at this critical time as we approach the summer months. Thank you for bearing with us as we got a late start today. My name is Don Huff. I'm with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. In this virtual training series tackles topics of critical importance to school leaders. We strive to lift up voices from the community to discuss the scope of challenges, strategies to address, lessons learned, and colleagues, and share resources and tools that can help improve the safety in your school community. Our session today will be specifically focused on K-12 emergency plans and how we can take advantage of these summer months. There's three takeaways that I hope we focus on today. First, what are some of the tactics to assess where you're at on your school safety journey? Second, some takeaways around ways to prioritize short, medium, and long-term improvements to your school safety posture. And then finally, I hope we can get into a discussion of who else you might want to involve in the safety planning process to make your life as a school leader easier and bring in some additional valuable perspective and expertise and potentially resources. On the right side of your screen, you'll see a question and answer pod. You're encouraged to, throughout today's discussion, submit questions there. We'll save some time at the end of the session for the moderators and for myself and our awesome panelists to go over that. You'll also find a link to a check-in survey. You're going to want to go ahead and fill that out at the start of the session and the end to receive a participation certificate for this training. Today's discussion, I'm joined by two incredible leaders within the K-12 community. First, Dr. Renee Bradley began her career as a teacher of students with emotional and behavioral disabilities, working in a variety of settings from self-contained to an inclusion program providing homebound services. Renee first joined the Department of Education in 1997, and among many roles has served as the Chief Project Officer for the National Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions, leading much of the federal work supporting schools around social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health, creating safe, positive environments for our students, and response and recovery to school violence across the country. I'm also joined today by Dan Pascal, who's a board-certified security and emergency management professional with more than 30 years of expertise supporting K-12 schools, communities as a consultant, instructor, trainer, author, and leader. He currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer for CoSecure, where he leads a team of experts supporting the K-12 community around physical security, cybersecurity, emergency preparedness, and business continuity. Dan, Renee, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Don.
So, I think about this opportunity here at the end of the year. There's so many maybe chapters that are closing across the country for schools, right? Final grades are due, graduations are happening, retirements, but it kind of creates this natural time of reflection for many schools. And one of those natural pauses might be, well, where are we at on our safety journey? What have we learned this year? How can we use what we learned or maybe what's changed in our community and use these summer months to better prepare as we prepare largely to come back in the fall? I think of this pause time of year is more than symbolic, that it's strategic. With fewer daily operational demands in the summer, it kind of gives us a unique window to take action, to review and update emergency operations plans, to build or strengthen partnerships, certainly to retrofit aging facilities, and to train adults in the building or prepare to train them as we reconstitute school in the fall so that we're ready for the unexpected. The need is real. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, more than 90% of public schools regularly conduct emergency drills, but only about 55% update their emergency operation plans consistently. This tells us there's a critical gap between the practice and preparedness. With the average age of a school in the United States approaching 50 years, many campuses are working with infrastructure that wasn't built with today's safety needs in mind. It's not lost on me that school safety is complex. It's physical, as well as it's emotional, procedural, and deeply cultural. It's not just about response, It's about the prevention, planning, and building systems that support readiness every day. I know that none of us can do this alone, whether it's local law enforcement, mental health providers, community organizations. The most effective school safety strategies are collaborative at their core. Today, Renee and Dan, our panelists, will help us unpack practical ways to assess where we are, prioritize what's next, and think about opportunities of the summer. Throughout today, you're going to hear real examples, tools, and tactics about schools and leaders across the country that are using right now to help move the paradigm from reactive to proactive. I encourage you to listen not just for the big ideas, but for the small, actionable steps that you can take back to your district and building and begin to move forward on. Every step matters because safety is a journey. So let's get started. Dan, Renee, I thought the place to start today's conversation was to ask you about this idea of year-end assessments and what it could look like for a school. What should K-12 school leaders, administrators be thinking about when considering identifying new risks, evaluating their progress, understanding what next steps in the planning cycle? Are there tools or benchmarks that you point them to that could help guide them if they're looking to take stock of where they are today? Dan, do you want to get started?
Sure, and thanks, Donna, and thanks again for allowing us to be here. It's a privilege to do that. I would say, as I look around the country and I think about the average public school and I think about the teachers and the leadership in those schools, it's often challenging, particularly as we start looking at what our focus points for the summer need to be. Because equally to security, we're worried about getting the bleachers changed out in right now in our gymnasium and what that's going to look like and how we're going to ultimately repair the fence and paint the curbs outside. But security is one that has to remain a priority all year round. And realistically, I say, when you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. And I think that's where we would like to see our schools go. And I think one of the challenges is really being able to prioritize projects based on risk, based on criticality to your school, your district, and things that are actionable to get done before the new school year. Trying to optimize that time when your students are less likely there. Although we have camps and other things that are occurring, we have less student involvement and less teachers. So I think, reviewing your lessons learned throughout the year, understanding if there was challenges that couldn't be solved during the year, big challenges that you had to address now, making sure we've indexed those, kept track of them, because the worst thing we can do is notify or observe those things in October, November, December, forget about them when we start getting to April and May in planning, and ultimately what we've done is kick the can down the road. So I really think that keeping track of those events all year, doing after action assessments in the moment when they occur is really important. And the other piece that I think we see it done well, and sometimes where it's not done so well, is making sure we're being extraordinarily inclusive and collaborative, bringing in our entire staff. Often we only look at the school leadership and the 2 or 3 folks around us, rather than looking at also program chairs, looking at our teachers, looking at some of our staff, our front office staff, our custodial staff, and others who contribute to that context.
I'll pick up on that, Dan. I like that you're talking about bringing in all staff, not just teachers, not just the leadership team. And I would even go beyond that. I think that we could do a much better job looking at where the youth voice fits into our safety and security discussions. I do want to remind people, teachers work really hard over the summer too. There's just a little bit of a break there, and a lot of schools are very busy, but it is an opportunity to think about what can we be doing better the next year. And one of the practices that we've seen really help schools think about, and you and I kind of talked about this earlier, how do we blend the safety and security world in with the prevention, preparation, and the school world better? I've seen schools implementing a multi-tiered system of support structure. So what do we do for all kids and staff? What do we do for some? And what do we do for the few that need our most intensive needs? And that seems to be a really promising practice that allows us to look at safety and security in the same way as we do academics or behavioral or some of our mental health needs. But I really want to plug the youth voice in this work. And you'll hear me say that a couple of times today. So they've got a really interesting perspective on what we're doing well and where we can do better. And as adults, we need to keep guessing on that and really let them take the pen on some of this.
That's so true. In my time in schools, who knows what's going on in the hallways best? It's often our students, right?
Yeah.
So if we're talking about taking stock, those would be critical voices.
Yeah. Now, I just, oddly enough, you mentioned teachers and how hard you work in the summer. And I always remember back to my first job in education, my interviewer said to me, well, do you like having the summers off? And I thought, this sounds wonderful. And I would tell you, I never worked harder in my life than I did during those summers planning for the next school year, because that's what it takes, right? It never ends. So that's a really great point. And I think our teachers and our staff should be recognized for what they do throughout the summer.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I think even the best laid plans or the best trained staff, right, when it comes to safety and security, it's about more than that. It's about the culture that surrounds safety and that it's sort of a norm in your school, right? So I often think about how the point of school is to be a space for young people to learn and grow and develop, but safety is foundational. It's a prerequisite to that. So what are the strategies or practices that you've seen about how to tie together school culture and make safety part of that process? And is there an opportunity specifically here with year end and the summer to be really intentional about how to foster that culture that safety is a priority and part of?
Yeah, I think so, Don, and I really think first we want to speak to some of our school leaders out there, because we constantly hear, and I understand where this comes from, the feeling of being overwhelmed. There is so much to do, and it can seem overwhelming at times, right? How we are prioritizing all of those needs and competing needs and interests. And I think the idea of building a culture of safety and security, and in all in nation, but it's true today. It's how you do the little things is how you do everything. The idea of reinforcement throughout the school year, throughout the non-academic year, is going to be really important and pay dividends. So bringing in those who are part of the planning process for us, inclusion of our teachers, our staff, and our student voice, listening to community concerns, and ultimately understanding what's happening at the local and national context. You know, sometimes we see something on television and we have an absolute response to that. We're going to have what we might say is knee-jerk or other things, where we spend all of our energy solving today's acute problem, as opposed to, again, if we are ready and we stay ready, we don't have to get ready. We have a process to deal with new challenges. So I'd say top down, left, right, and sideways, perhaps. Leadership sets the tone and the culture for who you are going to be. So when you're a principal, when you're a teacher, and you're out leading the fire drill, you're outside taking that attendance and reunification, you bring your book, you take it serious, everyone will. And I think that permeates throughout the schools. But what I would really say is, don't be overwhelmed. You know, there's no one size fits all. And while we absolutely encourage you to have an emergency operations plan, one that is certainly comprehensive, you probably won't use that 300-page document during an acute or dynamic event, right? I don't know anyone who's gone to stop and take the credenza wear off. So I don't want to be counterintuitive by saying this, but sometimes plans are nothing. Planning is everything. That process and that inclusion, I think, is what creates culture.
Yeah, I like how you said that. And how do we get to a point where including prevention and preparation is a part of the daily work of schools, just like teaching literacy skills or math skills? So it's not one more thing we do that's separate, it's actually there. So we've seen schools successfully integrate preparation and planning into grade level meetings or content area meetings or different teams that already exist in the school. But how do we use 5 or 10 minutes to talk about how is our prevention and preparation going? And I'd back up one more level that I think is really important when we're talking about culture is what is student engagement and instruction? What is connectedness to school? Because if you can measure those two things in a school, you're going to have a lot less need to work on your responses to events that disrupt the learning environment. So when kids are engaged in instruction and good teaching is happening in every classroom, they're less likely to engage in behaviors that might not be conducive to learning. And when kids feel a connection to the environment and they belong and someone misses them when they don't come to school, they're less likely to want to do harm in that environment. So how do we set the foundation of prevention and preparation?
What I really hear you both talking about is the importance of bringing people in creates buy-in, and that buy-in leads to the culture. Yeah. It's not lost on me your lead point too, but it starts from the top, right? Culture isn't something that can be outsourced to a staff member, right? It's everyone's duty, but it starts from the top.
Yeah, I agree. And just as we're talking and we're thinking about it, I think when we start getting into the idea of creating culture and we get into that overwhelmedness, one of the most significant things that I hear and my team hears as we work with schools across the country is it's very difficult to find time to train to create that culture. As we look at how do we do that in the summer, often that's our return, right? That's going to be late August, mid-August. We're going to bring our teachers back for a week, and we have loaded them for bear. If they were going to work 8 hours a day, we've put 15 hours a day of curriculum into that return to school. In many cases, 30 minutes of that is safety and security. Right. And I know from talking to the most passionate people around the country around school safety and security, being parents and teachers and those educators, we say our safety and security is our number one priority. Sometimes we have to be a little tough on ourselves and say, have we made it that priority? And I really think that goes back to what Renee is talking about. We've got to put our money where our mouth is sometimes, right? We have to say, we're going to carve out that hour, 2 hours, bring in our partners, our local law enforcement folks, make sure our teachers feel confident, because when bad things happen, our kids look towards our teachers and we want them to be prepared. And by the way, they're not security professionals, they're teachers.
Dan, I want to pick up on that idea a little bit of don't be overwhelmed, right? Because in my experience in schools, there's so many quote unquote to-dos, right? Things you could be the most productive and efficient, but often you don't get everything you wish you did done in a day. And that's the story of development. So with so many to-dos on the plate, how can schools effectively prioritize safety? Right? How does that look? Well, something I think a lot about with this is that safety isn't an activity, it's a journey, right? In that just doing training or just doing a plan doesn't make my school safe, right? It's certainly helpful and increases safety, but it's a journey, and that journey doesn't end. It's something that has to be continually worked, right? Much like the development of our young people. So what are some practical first steps that schools can think about when it comes to formalizing their safety strategy and prioritizing among all those to-dos for safety?
Yeah, I love that question. We probably would spend 3 hours getting through all of it. We're going to try to do it in probably 3 minutes or so between Renee and I. But I'd say one is you have to understand who is your security team. So if we start with the premise that everyone is responsible for security because it's our safety culture, right? We do have to narrow that down to the individuals that we rely on the most. And we've got to be able to have frequent security focused meetings. Again, many times security is a 5-minute agenda item on a 30-minute or hour-long staff meeting where we're going to focus on a lot of other things. And of course, that makes sense to do that. But the reality is we must prioritize security, again, from the top. So rather than say it is bullet 7 on today's agenda, we may need to have specific security-focused meetings with that team. Some schools call it a security committee, a safety committee, all around the same thing. I think that's one way to start doing it. Conducting those after action reviews, understanding complaints we've heard. So perhaps there's a security issue at your school and somebody looks at it, right? Somebody from maintenance goes and looks at that door that hasn't been locking, or someone said, hey, I noticed people are coming in the rear all the time. It's supposed to be locked. One person looks at it rather than bringing it to that safety committee and getting that buy-in. So we know we have a problem, we have to address it. Is it policy? Is it technology? Is it education? Is it enforcement? Might be all of those things. But together, you're looking at it and making it a priority. And the other thing I'd say is most of our schools, they know what their vulnerabilities are simply from word of mouth, but they haven't engaged in a formal process. And so without making it over the top and using really complex charts and graphs like sometimes we do, we have to understand what is likely to occur in our school, not just what's on TV, what is likely to face our school, our district, what is our level of preparedness and ability to handle or mitigate the effects, and what can't we handle where we need outside help, we're going to need outside resources, and to what magnitude. And that really backs up the idea, hope is not a strategy, luck is not a plan. So when you're doing these things, I think it really speaks well. And that ecosystem, that safety and security ecosystem that we talked about, putting together physical security, emergency response, threat assessment, looking at our staffing issues. When we put all of those things together, we have a better level of preparedness. So I'd really love folks to start thinking about that today.
Yeah, I like that. And, one thing you and I chatted about a little bit is safety is not a checklist. It's not something we say done, done, done. And I love that you brought up, the example of the door being open in the back of the classroom, because in the back of the school, rules and procedures aren't always enough. It has to be, how many times are we going to practice? So prevention becomes a part of the habits of our school. We're all humans and we are imperfect implementers of many things.
Okay.
So when we say don't prop the door open or don't let folks in, one of the doors that people aren't supposed to be entering,
Okay.
That's easy to say, it's hard to do. So how do we institutionalize these practices so that they become part of our habit and we incorporate it into regular business? Is it putting a sign up there, stop, don't open this door? Or is it coming around and checking after school about where doors are? So how do we do it just like instruction? We teach the expectations, we reinforce the expectations, and we practice the expectations. Right. So it becomes a habit of who we are and what we do.
Yeah. Renee, that's so important. And I think I do not a great job. I have to remind myself a lot about the safety as a journey, because to me, sometimes when I think, all right, what's next? How do I prioritize? I think about the next solution or shiny widget or trend. And so often what I've found is that it's important to make sure we're doing the basic stuff right. And that's okay to be prioritized, right? What's next in setting up your to-dos isn't always about doing the next level, but it's about continuing to get better at what we're doing. So things that don't cost money, like lock the doors, right? Visitor management, access control, right? School climate, school culture, all these pieces. It's okay on the journey to keep working those things, right? Just because we've done them once doesn't mean we've got there.
It sure is. Don, it's interesting you bring that point up. It's certainly something I assumed we would talk about today, but the idea of how we prioritize and what we do, and honestly, right now, a lot of pressure in the industry over the types of things and solutions that we're seeing. It's almost to the point where there's a new solution to a problem every day being offered as technology grows and is faster. And in some cases, these are great tools, but they don't replace having that culture of safety and security. Again, we can have technology failure, we can have systems failure. In most cases, the person who sees something and says something will be the most effective tool and better than a widget that we purchased.
Right.
And the other point I would say is when we prioritize those things, we prioritize our spend, we prioritize our policy development on those things that may not be the most appropriate to solve problems. We waste that time, that energy, that effort. We're training people when it might be that a policy piece or a $5 lock solved the problem that we were really intending to get to in the first place. And I just don't like our administrators feeling the pressure that they have to do something, they must buy something, they must invest or else. That's not the case always.
Right.
I really appreciate you bringing up the person who sees something being one of the most important pieces of this school safety. There are some researchers out of the University of Virginia, and I apologize, I'm not remembering their names at the moment, but they actually did a sample of high school students, and then they studied the students that said they would not report an incident. It was a very small, it was like 16%. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was about 16% and of the students. And they found that those students that said they wouldn't report were more disconnected from school, were more likely to be suspended, could not name a supportive adult in the school environment.
Yeah.
So I'm taking us back to these basics, kind of boring things that we have to do every day. We have to make sure that kids feel connected in a sense of belonging. We have to make sure that there's at least one adult, whether it's the custodian or the principal, that a kid can go to if they're in a crisis and feel like their concern is going to be taken fully and something's going to be done about it. So I know when I was a teacher a million years ago, we talked about, the connectedness and belonging, and people would say, oh, that's not important. And now we're finding out how important it really is for everyone in that school to feel the sense of connectedness and belonging.
Absolutely. I think with, prioritization sometimes means we need to do the next thing, but it's okay in this context that it's more often than not about doing the things we're doing better.
Better.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Renee, pick up on who, we know in the school building, right? We have our teammates, our teachers, our staff. Are there other folks that school leaders may want to think, especially over the summer months, to engage or invite into the emergency planning process, to maybe offer support or perspective that the school doesn't have today? And maybe I'm interested for both of you, why is it so critical that partnership and relationships are built in that planning phase, not after a crisis?
Yeah. So I'll take the who, and then I'll let you talk about that after, if you from the security perspective. But the last 3 years, I've been working a lot with schools that are recovering from school violence incidents, and there's some unique partners that I think we haven't fully taken advantage of. So when we're thinking about inside the school and school safety, I would point to custodians, number one, in our school. I think they're undervalued with what they can bring to students, and that friendship and partnership with so many teachers. And I would speak to the role of coaches, which I think we haven't fully utilized their expertise in helping. Outside of schools, of course, we talk about our mental health providers. I'll let you talk about the security folks, but some that we might not have thought about are athletic association. What is the soccer league that's close to your school? So how can they help reinforce some of the behaviors? Like getting along on the soccer field is important as getting along in school. So how do we reinforce some of those? And I would also put a plug in for some of our faith-based institutions, faith and non-faith, but the faith-based institutions in some of our communities, I'm from the South, and down there we cook for anything. So, how can they support teachers? How can, when they're going through recovery, or how can they help be a place if a school has to shut down after an incident where some tutoring could possibly be available? So we've got to get a lot more creative. Schools don't have a lot of money. So how do we get creative about who we can bring in, both preventatively, but also if something were to happen, to be a partner in that work?
Yeah, I've heard of some schools even doing during the summer months sort of an invited open house, if you will, to those community orgs, right?
Yep.
And having them in just to have a conversation, right?
Yep.
But Dan, help elevate us here. What are your thoughts in this space?
Yeah, I think we're all really familiar with sort of the obvious ones, the first responders from the community. It's a great time in the summer to start reaching out to, if you're not already engaged with, your local police department, fire agencies, first aid, rescue, those folks are great too, for a couple of reasons. One, it's great to have a partnership, as my good friend Joe always says. You don't show up and exchange business cards at a fire, right? That's not the time to do that. So number one, you want to have familiarity, but two, again, there's that invaluable time during the summer when oftentimes these first response organizations can get more familiarized with your school, its buildings, and even do training, which law enforcement and fire folks are desperate for locations for them to actually come and train and go through real world scenarios. And we've seen this after a number of dynamic events where we found out departments had done that already, and it was invaluable to do so. So those folks, I think we know to do that, but I encourage you to do that. And if you have SROs in your school and others, of course, use them for that. I think there is some opportunity, particularly to reach out to local businesses. I think a lot of school administrators think of that at booster time. Well, we're gonna go collect maybe some fees and we're gonna, do a cookie sale or bake sale. But when we think about protracted events, so non-dynamic events that we might see, right, as we've gone through pandemics and other challenges, weather-related events, we may need supplies or resources from local businesses in the community. So it's a great way to have a public-private cooperation to do that. So I think this is a great time this summer to strengthen our MOUs. If you don't have them, create them, enter into that partnership, know what you can expect from each other. Because truthfully, collaboration and having partners is really about force multiplication, right? There's resources and we need those resources, but force multiplication, when you say I've got a relationship with these local groups and I need surge capacity, something is happening affecting my school or the whole district. I have folks who are coming to help me. That's an invaluable feeling when the cavalry shows up, no matter what they look like. That could be volunteers to pick things up today. It could be law enforcement, don't know, but we need them.
Yeah, Don, I would add in there too, if we've got folks from our private schools and other non-public schools, is the partnership with the public school system for those private and, non-public schools, because there have been occasions where the public schools have provided bus support or provided additional, mental health or counseling support. So as we talk about all these partners for our private school audience, I encourage them to be in a partnership with their public schools as well.
Great point, Renee. Thanks for bringing that up too. And I should have thought of that too. We work with countless numbers, honestly, of independent and private schools, and resource allocation and the abilities are different, and the expectations of when students are coming. Some are residential campuses, so now we're housing folks, we have different responsibilities, and sometimes there will be a line between the who's, but again, partnering with your public school and private schools is another great way to have shared resources, but also shared goals.
I know just in my experience here at CISA, we were working with this at school and first responders, and it was a bit of a known that the school was a cell phone dead zone, not great reception, and just reception problems. But it wasn't until we got on site with multiple law enforcement agencies, just having a conversation about safety, that we realized that their communications weren't interoperable because of that low latency of things. It's discoveries like that that can happen over the summer that are critical to what we're doing here. And
so in that case, walkie-talkies would be really important in that school, and not just for one or two people, but all teachers need to be able to communicate during a crisis situation.
Or a simple question like, how are we all, for these summer meetups, how are we going to work if we lose comms or we lose power, right? What's our pen and paper, our backup plan? So on that point, for our participants, I know that they are seeing in the right-hand column of their screen, resources pop up. You're going to find an example MOU from our federal team here. You're going to see the guide to developing high-quality emergency operations plans from the federal government led by the Department of Education. These are some great resources as we're chatting today to help you put your hands and take action to take back some of the practices we're talking about today. But I do want to pivot our conversation just a bit to the topic of retrofitting and upgrading our physical plant over the summers, right? I said at the top of today's session that many of our schools are operating in buildings that are 50 years old, weren't necessarily designed with today fully in mind. So retrofitting, upgrading, upscaling, what are some of the low-cost upgrades that schools can make that sort of give a big return on investment when it comes to improving safety? And and maybe don't take the capital planning in the same way, or the we need to have students at another building for months to get this in place, that could kind of get done over the summer. Can you guys approach that a bit for us?
Yeah, and I'm happy to take the lead if you want me to, Renee.
Go ahead.
Excellent. I would say a few things, right? So there are some big things and little things, and there are big little things and little big things. And what does that all mean, right? It means that there are huge projects, as you mentioned, capital projects that I think a lot of folks spend time and energy on. Again, getting back to our prioritization discussion, that may not be what actually is best for the school, for the district, right? It's the bigger plan. It's what we've thought about for months. I think if we prioritize things based on risk, what we've seen all year, we take that data, that after action reports, those security reviews, we gather input from our teachers and our key stakeholders and say, where did we go wrong? Where were we amiss? And what is actionable in the summer? We can find oftentimes low cost issues that can make a difference. So you might look at, of course, we look at exterior door locks and access to our facilities. What does that look like in our school? Did we have a number of doors that were left open for the year? Was a constant problem we found prop doors? Do we have door position switches that tell us, hey, a door is being held open or it was forced open? Send the notification to the office or to our security team, depending on your particular circumstance, so we can go check that out and have quick action. Something easy, very easy to do. Clearing your halls, right? Just having really good natural observation inside the building. So I don't want to upset any of our teachers that are watching today, because we love to put things in hallways. We love to decorate our classrooms. We'd like to make school spirit. But one of the easiest things we can do is be able to look down our hall and see where our students are, make sure no one is hiding, make sure there are no problems that we need to detect. I would be very honest with you, oftentimes, particularly in public schools, when I walk through the school, I have to move and maneuver around things, especially if there's a class change going on, which is not conducive to the best level of security we'd like. So that's a real easy thing. Go through school, see what's out there, see what's filling up your halls. And then little things. Paint your curbs, fix that hole in the fence that you've been saying, well, someone could fit through there. Hey, let's go out and fix that now, add some signage where you need it. Get the good people to go where we want them to go. Keep the honest just because it's the middle of the year. Have good wayfinding signage. Trim your landscaping, maintain it, know what you want to be. And then I would say utilize free resources, right? This is one. Schoolsafety.gov is loaded with tremendous resources and great people who will pick up the phone and call and help you. Things like the PASS organization, the Partner Alliance for Safe Schools, has published standards in multiple volumes. ASIS has school safety standards, all free, right? Pick them up, read them, and actually implement them the best that you can.
I'm going to reiterate, because I think it's so important. The two things that we see over and over that are not extremely costly are classroom locks that lock from the inside and controlled entry. And most schools can do those with very little cost. So I appreciate you stealing that from me. And I just wanted to reiterate, and I'm going to add one more. I am so happy you brought up the classroom changes, because that's like a scary time, being in a high school or middle school classroom changes and thousands of kids in a hallway in some of these big schools. Increased visibility and access to adults in public spaces is another very easy change that we can make to retrofit or upgrade a school. If teachers are standing in their hallway doors, not in the hall to be an obstruction, but in their hallway doors, it makes students feel safer. They're more likely to continue to, abide by the school-wide expectations and how everyone's supposed to be successful. If those teachers standing in their door can every once in a while say something positive to one of the millions of kids walking by them, that even boosts it even higher. So those would be my two big retrofitting
Thank you.
suggestions. Yeah.
Thank you. School or summer is a great time, and I know that we spend a lot of it thinking about and getting ahead for the fall, right? But I think there was a time where it was, when we came to safety training, it was the first responders or the safety committee in the school. I think the realization is that it's about all adults, and all people in the school need to know their role in something. So I want to think about the training perspective of that a little bit. In what schools can do to help better prepare for the fall when we know that there's going to be a lot of safety and security training, and what do adults in the building need to know? Looking at some of our participant questions today, I'd add in, how do we make it really stick, really practical, and something that isn't just a check the box activity when it comes to safety and security training?
I'll start out on this one. I think you need to think about who needs to be trained. And I would say the answer to that is everyone needs to be trained. And then the second question I would ask is who needs to be trained in what and to what extent? So I am a firm believer that all adults in the building need to be trained on what are the procedures, safety procedures in the school. And the importance of not just training the administrators or the leadership team or 3 to 4 people, because we don't know if they're going to be sick one day or compounded something terrible. So how to train all the adults. It's training adults for all kinds of safety. You probably, Dan, will speak to this much better than I am, but how do we train for fire drills? How do we train for a lockdown? It should be, how do we train for, safety drills and their different components on each of those? The reality is in a crisis situation, the students are going to follow the adults in the room. So the adults need to be the ones that have the most significant training in our safety plans. I also have seen the importance of adults having some basic training in first aid, basic training in de-escalation skills or conflict mediation. So those are things that we think about in the old kind of social skills training that we used to do a lot in schools. But how are some of our teachers trained to do that as well?
Yeah, and I don't want to go backwards too far, but I would say, again, it comes down to prioritization. You have to be committed to making training a priority. Again, with those competing interests that we have, very limited time when our staff is available, we have to be committed. It takes that top-down power to say, we're committed, we're going to do this. And if my safety director or my SRO or whomever is in charge says I need a 2-hour block, well, darn it, we're going to find a 2-hour block, right? I'm going to find that time. And I think once we do that, it sets us up. I couldn't agree with Renee more on all of our adults being trained. Now, I think the great point, though, is that not everyone is going to have the same training. There are roles and responsibilities. Teachers will generally have a certain role versus our staff members who are coming through the building, working outside, leadership to manage through the incident. And it really comes back, and Don probably knows what I'm going to say, to something I talk about all the time, this idea of the tragic trio: communication, organization, and leadership. How do we communicate both horizontally, vertically throughout the organization, and technically, right? Renee brought up a great point earlier as well. Well, in some cases, we may need to use walkie-talkies. In some cases, you may use the old public address system, right? Mr. Dewey has left the building, and good morning, students of Rydell High. Those systems still work, and they can also be low-tech systems, right? We may have runners and bullhorns and different things we use when we reunify. So that is really important. But then how are we organized? If everyone is trying to do everything at once, you're sort of in a situation where no one is doing anything. Right. We're all looking at each other for the magic leader to tell us what to do. So we have to be organized to be our best. So everyone has a role, some management by objective with some backups. Because also, as we mentioned, today is the day where, Dawn is not here and Renee is not here. Well, she's the only person who leads us out the building for the fire. Well, we're in trouble, right? So we can't do that. And then we have to have great leadership. And while no superintendent, no principal that I know actually started out their career saying, I want to be a security professional or practitioner, I want to enrich the lives of students and educate our future, all of them must have the leadership quality and capability that during the bad time, when everyone's looking to them, they have a really good framework of what to do. They have muscle memory in place from training, and they can respond and lead us through the event. And let's be honest, most of these big events we're talking about are 10 minutes worth of leadership. When we start looking at natural events that are occurring, weather-related events, most of those we can do some pre-planning for. Most of those we have time, which is on our side. When we look at more of those dynamic emergencies, we don't have time to consult with the book.
Yeah.
Don, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up under the training umbrella. what I mentioned earlier about what is effective instruction and how do we engage in students in that in a positive way. I think it's important for schools to have expectations so kids don't need to guess what it takes to be successful in this school. So, what are the expectations of conduct? How do we get along with one another? Because that's the foundation on which all these other safety things that Dan talks about, it really has to be there.
Yeah, it's so important. It kind of comes full circle. So, Renee, one of the other questions we've received from the audience is thinking about emergency planning and integrating sort of your multi tier system of support, your crisis intervention, maybe your behavioral threat assessment management, and the intersection of those with emergency planning. Do you have thoughts about how those things fit together? I know you were talking earlier kind of about silos, or this is over here, this over here, and that not being the model. So are those some of the type of things you were thinking about?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring that up because we're doing some work now looking at some of the threat assessment, BTAM, that is here in this office somewhere, and how that looks with PBIS. And in that exercise, we were saying, well, we need to look at this multi-tiered system and what are the security things like, door locks, things, some of the security things, and then where does threat assessment come in as part of that multi-tiered system, what we do for all, some, and few. So some kids might need to participate in a conflict resolution class or an anger management class. That might not be needed for everybody. Everybody needs some kind of bullying and harassment prevention, and all of those are part of safety and security. So I'm hoping that there are going to be some resources on the horizon that can help folks out with that. There are a couple of resources that we, I think might be in the chat somewhere, that look at what are some of these basic, simple things that we can do in schools. And that would be a good site to go and get the ones that we're hoping are going to come out soon. But that's a big question we're getting from states and districts. How do we blend more seamlessly the security aspects with the business of school?
One question, and I could talk to both of you for all day, but I love the practicalness and the evidence that you guys bring to the table when we talk about this. Something else that we've received quite a bit in the chat is we were talking about partners. What's the role of parents when it comes to emergency management planning? How do we make them, bring them in, make them part of the plan? What's sort of their role? Dan, do you have a thought there?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on them, but I'm trying to limit them, which is to say that parents are absolutely essential in the communication and two-way communication process for school and school leadership for a number of reasons that vary in nature. One being, we have to let parents know what's going on, right? We have to let them know where we're at, an event has occurred, with timely, accurate, and useful information. So when we know what it can be, we can put that information out. That's sort of what we would call an informing portion of emergency communication. Think of AIR, you think of alerting, something really bad has happened, we have to tell people to take action, right? Clear the halls, lock down. Then we inform folks. We have a little more information about what is occurring right now, what may be impacted and how long. Then later we have the R, we reassure people. The event is over. This is what is happening. This is what you do. I think parents have to do that. But I think if we exclude them, and we've seen unfortunate examples of this both here and internationally, if we are not informing parents at the right rate, the right level, and of course every parent determines what that is, but a reasonable level, the bad thing is they are likely going to show up at our school. And I don't blame them. Their children are there. They want to make them safe. They want to make sure it's okay. But oftentimes that's not the right location for them to be. So I think it's really important to let parents know how you will communicate with them, what the expectations are of them. If you have a reunification center set up, this is how we'll let you know how you'll get your children. We'll keep you updated, whether you're using social media, whether you're using intranet, whether you're using a student management system. All those things are important, but I think they're essential to the buy-in and support that the school or the district has.
Yeah, and I'm going to hear about not bringing up parents' role from people. I'm hearing who's going to give me a ring about it. But I would make sure, just like I was talking about student voice, that parent voice is at the table when you're developing your emergency management plans, when you're talking about what are your cultural school-wide expectations in your school, how you want students to behave, because that can be reinforced at home. Parents can do that. Parents also are very involved in their communities for the most part, or take part in different aspects of the community. Our schools are nested in communities. Some of our communities are not the safest communities. So we need those parents. There have been great examples of parents, coming together and doing different kind of safe passages for students that walk to schools. There are communities where, gunshots and violence is common. How can the parents can be super helpful, and how do we create this little space called school where we can do something different and make sure we're preparing kids for all the opportunities that they can have? And parents have to be involved in that from that community aspect.
Without a doubt. Today's conversation has been so interesting to me, from how do we take stock of where we are to how do we think about the universal safety of culture of safety as part of what we're doing. Prioritizing, if prioritizing means continuing to upgrade and reinforce our foundations, who we can get involved, how we retrofit, how we train, all critical topics that I know school leaders are thinking about, but talking with both of you really helps with that. I want to ask one more question to you, but before I do, for our participants in the chat, you're seeing another poll pop up, which gives you a chance to share some feedback about today's experience, as well as would encourage you to fill that out. Again, if you're seeking a participation certificate for today's session, those will come out in the follow-up days, but do be sure to complete that, as well as go ahead and bookmark some of those resources that I know you've been checking out through the conversation. So Dan and Renee, with our limited time left, the thing I want to leave us with and seek from you is talk to me about what makes you hopeful in this space, right? School safety isn't easy, right? There's nothing more important than our young people. But do you have any success stories about strong emergency plans that have either helped schools avoid or navigate tough situations that you think is germane to this group?
Sure. So yes, so there's a lot to be hopeful for, first and foremost. Let's make sure that we have that point be echoed here today. When I think back to tragic events that have occurred at schools throughout our country's history, and I'm looking at 25 years plus forward, I would tell you that if you've gone out and listened to folks who have been engaged or lived through those events, in today's climate, almost none of those concerns or vulnerabilities are significant when I go to a school. Right? When we look at how do we control access, how do we ultimately, do we utilize cameras? Do we have good policies in place? Do we have response MOUs? So all the things we're telling you to strengthen and do, I would say the hope is we have come leaps and bounds. Let's not refuse to look at progress, because there is a bad event that happens today or tomorrow that's going to happen. And I would say that, working with as many schools as I've been privileged to work with, I would say there's always one that sticks out to me because we were so engaged in it. I won't mention the school or the state, but just really that exemplar way of going about process. And we had an incident that thankfully was a near miss, where a student saw something, said something to the school administrators, who worked with their school resource officer who's familiar with them and familiar with the students, who escalated that to an investigation, ultimately was able to go off campus to investigate this threat, found it to be valid, and was able to make an arrest in this case pre-event, right? And then ultimately the school was able to effectively communicate what had happened, why it had happened, and assure safety to the community, because they had planned. Because communication, organization, and leadership, back to the tragic trio, is something that's so important. That school in particular, that district, had been planning for a number of years, an intentional process, had a plan, but they still didn't need to pull that plan out because they knew what to do. They had practiced it, they had inclusion, and it worked out to a successful outcome. So I think we can see a lot more of that in the future, and I certainly hope so. Please, no one should walk away discouraged that there's too much to do. There's plenty of resources to do them.
Yeah, as I said earlier, the last 3 years, I've been working more with schools that are in the recovery part of their experience. And I think my hope lies in the fact that we do know a lot better how to do the things that need to be done, both as prevention, but we also know more about what recovery looks like. So we are getting better at identifying critical factors of what teachers need to know and how they need to be supported prior to students returning to school. And then what does it look like to support students and staff during a recovery journey? I'm forgetting who said it, but we've all heard the do your best until you know better, and then do better.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a great quote around what the recovery journey looks like and how we're doing better at looking at what are the key things that we need to do. When folks are in crisis, they don't need a whole laundry list. They need what are the smallest things I can do to make the biggest difference and the biggest outcome. And I think we're getting better at that. We still have a long road ahead of us, but I think we're getting better.
Yeah. Dan, Renee, thanks for spending this hour with me. And to our participants out there, thanks for what you're doing to help our young people, to help our communities, and serve schools. School safety is foundational to the educational mission, and I really appreciate that you spent the time with us here today at CISA and in this virtual training to have that conversation. I hope you have a great summer.